His legal situation, rather like his own solicitor, will probably be aware of what's in it, but it will need to be opened in the way that our wills would be when we die. What I think is also interesting is when the Pope left Poland to come to the conclave where he was elected, he came with just $10 in his pocket. That's an extraordinary situation. And when you think that with only $10, that is how he walked into the greatest office that the Roman Catholic Church has, it's extraordinary.
And at what stage, and this is very briefly please, did he stipulate the nature of his funeral?
I don't know when he will have... Oh, well, he produced a constitution in the 18th year of his papacy called Universa Dominici Gregi, and that's where it's all written out.
Alistair, we'll come back to you very soon. Lots more fascinating information about this incredible man. And good morning to you. You're watching Sky News. It's 3 o'clock. Pope John Paul II has lost his fight for life. One of the longest serving popes, the 84-year-old gave up his long battle with ill health shortly after 8 o'clock last night. Tributes have been pouring in from world leaders and ordinary Catholics in memory of a man who led the Catholic Church since 1978. And these are the live pictures of the Vatican, still floodlit, but obviously there aren't many people around at the moment. At the peak last night, there were 100,000 people in the square. Joel Hills now looks at the night's momentous events.
It was the announcement the crowd had expected and feared.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle,
Brothers and sisters, at 9:37 this evening, our beloved Holy Father, John Paul II, has returned to the house of the Father. Let us pray for him.
Preghiamo per lui.
The announcement was met with applause, an Italian sign of respect.
Gloria Patri et Filio.
The bells rang out across St. Peter's Square, across the city, the faithful and the curious lost in thought. For some, the emotions were overwhelming. News of the Pope's death spread quickly. In Paris, the bells of Notre Dame were rung 84 times, once for each year of the Pope's life. In London too, prayers were said. Westminster Cathedral will remain open throughout the night for people to sign a book of condolences. It's an opportunity to pay tribute, to put feelings into words.
He was an extraordinary man. One of the greatest popes in the Church's 2,000-year history. We will remember him for his witness to hope and to the dignity of human life. We'll remember him for his extraordinary energy, for reaching across boundaries of religion and race.
The influence of John Paul's reign has been felt around the world. In Mexico, he's remembered and loved by millions. A man who showed compassion in life and dignity in death. Joel Hills, Sky News.
Perhaps nowhere was the Pope's death more deeply felt, of course, than his native Poland. Sky's Lawrence Lee reports now from Krakow, where the Pope spent much of his adult life.
They are glorifying him here, as elsewhere in the world, and yet celebration of an extraordinary life seems utterly subsumed by a collective, overwhelming grief. At times it seemed like the whole of Krakow was in tears. They had had so much time to prepare themselves for this, and yet when the time came, they still seemed to have no way of dealing with it.
People are very sad. I saw a few people was crying, a lot of people was crying. And a few people, I think I saw a lot lost the consciousness. It's very sad. Every people pray and pray.
They came out in vast numbers supporting each other. Under the Archbishop's palace, where he served and returned time and again to bless his people, the crowd swelled and filled every corner. Hardly anyone could bring themselves to speak. Physical pain was simply ignored, or perhaps not even noticed. They simply can't believe he's gone. He was their ideal in so many ways, not only as God's representative on earth, but as the man who lionized Poland throughout the 20th century against Nazism, against communism. He was our Pope, said one man to me tonight. There are no words. Which in turn leads to a new question of how this country, which has relied on his spiritual and his political guidance for so long, can now move on. And so they made for home to the sound they never wanted to hear, the cathedral bells ringing out, the news of John Paul's passing. Surely he wouldn't have wanted them to suffer so much on his behalf, but they will put themselves through it again today. Lawrence Lee, Sky News, Krakow in Poland.
Buckingham Palace has released this statement. The Queen has conveyed to the Holy See a deep sorrow on receiving news of the death of His Holiness Pope John Paul II. Her Majesty remembers the untiring efforts of Pope John Paul II in promoting peace and goodwill throughout the world. Tony Blair released a statement saying he had been a remarkable man. He said the world has lost a religious leader who was revered across people of all faiths and none, and was an inspiration, a man of extraordinary faith, dignity and courage. He never wavered, never flinched in the struggle for what he thought was good and right. The Conservative Party leader, Michael Howard, said a deep sense of loss would be felt by all faiths. He said in a world of change and uncertainty, people saw him as a rock, steadfast in support of freedom, unswerving in opposition to totalitarianism, robust in defence of Christian values. The Catholic Church has lost a truly remarkable Pope and the world a great spiritual leader. The Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, said, "I recall very fondly my meetings with him, particularly sitting with him in his private quarters discussing the question of war and peace. He was extremely concerned about the world we live in, and like me, he also felt that in war we are all losers." The Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, paid tribute to the Pope's efforts to secure peace in troubled parts of the world. "I wonder whether all the changes would have happened in Eastern Europe if he'd not been there for the last quarter of a century," he said. "I don't think it would have. I think he had a powerful influence on that change." So, Pope John Paul II, the man known as the People's Pope, has died at the age of 84. Born in Poland, he was the first non-Italian to head the Roman Catholic Church in more than 450 years. He'll be particularly remembered for his world travel and his outspoken views against oppression and social injustice. Sky's Alex Rossi looks back at his life.
An image of what a pope should be, but it's an image created by John Paul II. Before him, pontiffs were largely remote, aloof figures confined within the walls of the Vatican. But John Paul II was a new pope for a new age. He became one of the most famous faces in the world, using his celebrity to further his mission as he visited more than 100 countries, circling the globe over 30 times. The desire to expand and protect the Catholic Church had its roots in hardship. Karol Wojtyła was born in the small town of Wadowice near Krakow. He spent his childhood in this house, now a museum. They were difficult years. His mother died when he was just 9. His brother 3 years later. In 1939, when he was in his late teens, his native Poland was invaded by the Germans. He'd already chosen to go into the church, but under the Nazi occupation had to conduct his studies in secret at an underground seminary. After the war, Poland became a communist country, and the young priest struggled to maintain his religion in an officially atheist state. Showing the determination that was to become his hallmark, he rose swiftly through the Catholic hierarchy. Nevertheless, his election to the papacy in 1978 was unexpected for a number of reasons. He was the first pontiff from behind the Iron Curtain, an appointment which sent shockwaves through the Soviet Empire. He was also the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, and at 58, the youngest in a century. His relative youth and active lifestyle earned him the nickname God's Athlete. In the coming years, he was to draw heavily on these physical reserves. John Paul's papacy was almost ended in 1981 when a would-be assassin shot him in St. Peter's Square. An amateur cameraman captured the moment 4 bullets struck the pontiff. So grave were his injuries, he received the last rites. His recovery was viewed by many as miraculous. John Paul put it down to divine intervention, claiming the hand of Our Lady guided the bullets away from his vital organs. He later went to prison to offer forgiveness to the man who'd tried to kill him. The Pope never regained his former physical strength, but resumed his work with undiminished determination. Never fearing controversy, he gave his full support to the fledgling Solidarity movement in his native Poland. When he returned home in 1991 after the fall of communism, it was to a hero's welcome. The Pope's commitment to peace was long-standing. On a trip to Ireland early in his papacy, and well before the peace process had got underway, he issued this appeal.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
When he visited the UK in 1982, he was the first Pope to set foot on British soil for 450 years, heralding a new era of interdenominational cooperation. South Africa was another country on the papal itinerary, but on his insistence only after the apartheid regime had been removed.
To say the visit is long overdue is to pay tribute to your own abhorrence of the system of apartheid.
More recently, he was at the forefront of opposition to the war against Iraq, telling both Tony Blair and President Bush it was a failure of humanity. But many who admired the Pope's commitment to political freedom were less impressed by his unyielding stance on matters of doctrine. His views on the ordination of women, abortion, contraception and homosexuality were unapologetically conservative. Many liberal Catholics regarded his reaction to the paedophile scandal which rocked the church in America as too little, too late. As he wrestled with the problems of making the church relevant in the new millennium, John Paul II embarked on a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ, he visited the Church of Nativity, where tradition says Jesus was born. Shutting out the unceasing demands imposed on him by his office, John Paul II prayed alone. But the trip was not purely spiritual. Here too was a political dimension. He visited Yad Vashem, the memorial in Israel to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. An act of contrition on behalf of the Vatican, which had, during the war, remained silent about the Holocaust. He also used the pilgrimage to build bridges with Muslim leaders, part of the Pope's long-standing efforts to foster greater understanding between religions. The first undeniable sign of the Pope's failing strength came in Slovakia, when he was unable to finish a mass in front of 200,000 believers. Vatican officials abandoned attempts to deny that Parkinson's disease was diminishing the Pope's powers. On his final visit to Poland,